This is a very serious session, so I want you to take it extremely seriously. What we're going to be talking about, or actually what they're going to be talking about, is principally about security, defense, how we look at the future of security in the broader sense. And I think it's become particularly important, and they're in the field, so they could disagree, but we're really seeing some fairly serious changes in the whole spectrum of what we now bring into security, which is part of it. But also part of it is because I think there's been a big shift over the last decade or two of moving from protecting territory, really, to protecting communities, which is a little different, right? Depending on which countries you're talking about, but there's so much now that falls under security, whether it's between general national security or internal security, or ministers of the interior and so on and so forth, that there's a much more, what I call a broader spectrum approach to this, and really a paradigm shift in the foundational vision. And we're going to be talking about a number of the aspects of this, because I think partly it's because of the asynchronicity of the battleground, right? I mean, cyber's changed this considerably. It's become a very, very big part. I mean, just to make a point, that the amount of money that goes into cyber, or did last year in the US, was still significantly lower than the amount of investment that went into fighting drugs. And yet, the actual, if you talked about the cost of cyber versus the cost of the other, and I'm talking from a societal point of view, it's considerably more. So there's a lot of changes. There's a lot of things that this embrace within this, right? Whether it's, and the speakers will be talking about it from different aspects. We're going to start off by Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Orders talking about some of the trends, global strategic trends, or global trends within the field, in the security field, defense and security. And then we'll be talking about, I wouldn't say the future of wars, hopefully it's the future of peace, but what that means, right? How do we create peace, or how do we develop, how can we even possibly look at peace if we don't understand what the alternative would be and how we can confront that? And then we'll be talking very, very much about, from Roman here, about other aspects of this, and he did a piece of really exciting research to understand where security was going, and he'll talk about that. And then we're going to talk about other risks, financial risks. What's this all mean? These are all wrapped together, right? At the end of the day, we're talking about the risks involved in these areas of security. I could go on forever, since this is one of the subjects I deal with a lot, and I'm not going to. I think that one of the things that concerns me, and I hope it comes up, is the whole issue and the importance of transdisciplinarity, which is, and now of course, in most of the universities we're beginning to teach subjects in that way to a certain degree, because when we start to look at the impact of, genetics with bio, with nano, with quantum, and so on and so forth, the possibilities of having a completely new breed of weaponry and a completely new breed of security breaking systems and a completely new breed of crimes and criminals and agents that are involved in these activities is great. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Orders, who's going to talk about the trends. Right, Ryan? There you go.
Thanks, Derek. G'day everyone. So, my name's Ryan. From my accent, you can probably tell I'm an Australian, but I work in the UK Ministry of Defence at the moment on exchange. What I want to talk about this morning is just to set the scene, high-level trends associated with defence and security, and I'll cover that through three main areas: society, the economy, and the environment. And I'll also touch briefly on great power competition, and just a couple of comments on the competition between China and the US and other great powers. Before I get further into it, for those of you who aren't aware of the Development Concepts and Doctrine Centre, it's effectively the intellectual centre for the UK MOD, sometimes referred to as its think tank. It's been around for about 20 years, and the main publication it produces is called Global Strategic Trends, which is produced every 4 or 5 years. Edition 6 is currently available, and it's available online. And at the end of this presentation, most of our documents, even though we're a defence department, are actually unclassified and releasable, and anything that is available online. So when you get to the end, you'll see the links to our website. You can go there and have a look. Excellent. So this was a map we produced back in Global Strategic Trend 6, and it basically is a relative stress map of the world in 2050 as we saw it at that point in time. What we did is we considered the interplay of 7 key drivers of stress. Those were water and food security, population demographics, state fragility, the impacts of climate change, and the locations of megacities and trade choke points. I will just highlight this is a relative stress map, so the areas in grey don't indicate no stress or low stress, it's all relative to each other. So if we look at this and we take this analysis at face value, then looking at the future, this is the region that has the greatest stress and therefore the greatest potential for conflict going out to 2050. However, despite that, current global attention is shifted towards conflict within the Indo-Pacific. And that's largely geared towards the issues we have of geopolitics and great power competition, particularly with the rise of China and how the world will respond to that, led by, or in main part, through the USA. And so we see at the moment there's a shift where we've been in a unipolar world for the last couple of decades, where the US has been that dominant power, and we're moving towards a multipolar world. And this is a world where we like to see China and other nations, including India, grow in influence and compete with the current power being the US. So if you can keep this map in mind, and I'll kind of come back or refer back to it towards the end, but what I want to do now is just shift to some of the key trends across the 3 areas of society, economy, and the environment. So first off, I'll talk about changes to the natural environment. So access to resources. This has always been a point of inequality between nations, okay, as to who has access to the different resources that the world relies on. What we note, though, is as climate change progresses, this will be exacerbated, but also shift between different countries. And so what you'll see is countries that currently are rich in food production, okay, and the global food bowls, as well as water sources in particular, okay, may see shifts in their resource capabilities or resource richnesses or otherwise due to climate change. An example of this where we see a high likelihood of this occurring, okay, is in the Mekong region in Asia, where a combination of damming, hydropower and agricultural use by multiple nations is creating a source of tension around water access. The next one I'll talk about is the competition in shared spaces. And so shared spaces are those things such as the oceans, beyond exclusive economic zones, space, and also the poles. This creates potential areas for future conflict because of the demand for resources in these areas. Expansion into these domains is becoming increasingly easy, and it's moving beyond an ability of just a nation state to be able to operate in these areas, where multinational corporations and individuals can also influence these areas on our planet. And the problem with that is a lot of these areas are largely ungoverned, or the governance position isn't sufficiently developed on a global stage to be able to control or influence how people will or won't behave. With the high north and the Arctic region, climate change is likely to see the expansion of trade routes, and that was mentioned in one of the presenters this morning, who suggested a move towards the polar regions from the equatorial regions. So the next part is, as governments trade and negotiate, climate policies are likely to become a key point of bargaining power in all aspects of geopolitics. We also think that there may be, or there's evidence to suggest that waste deposits that currently exist may actually evolve in future to be areas of resource extraction. So the ability to mine and extract resources from what were previously dumps due to our advances in technology of recycling and the like. And this could see shifts, again, in resource control from countries that have large deposits of waste that they're able to repurpose and recycle in the future. So, and the last point on the environment is the evidence that we see at the moment going forward is there's a high reliance on technology to solve our environmental woes of climate change and to address climate change. The ability for human behaviour to sufficiently adjust as we need to meet the challenges of climate change and the environmental impact is largely insufficient. And so as a society, what we're doing is shifting towards technology to be our saviour in this place. And it'll be interesting to see how COP26 plays out and the ongoing commitments and rhetoric from governments as we go forward as to how they address the environmental challenges. And it is noted too that we'll continue to consume more in this region, and our consumption will significantly increase. And we see this particularly evident within Africa and Asia as the populations there grow, and we see a move from a large expansion of the global middle class. And once you expand the global middle class, the consumption rates significantly increase. So moving on to the economy. The economy will continue to be a major driver of global change. And in many cases, economic prosperity will be prioritised in all geopolitical negotiations and agreements. So that economic prosperity comes into conflict, or competition, I should say, with that environmental sustainability that I spoke with before. It is likely that environmentally conscious technology and policies will become increasingly financially beneficial as we go ahead, which will make them compete better with our traditional energy sources such as coal and fossil fuels. However, we're not at the point where we see coals and fossil fuels completely moving away and countries moving away from those at a global level. They'll still be required and in demand. So investment in defence and security will obviously be constrained by economic factors. However, great power competition that we're seeing at the moment is likely to drive up defence spending globally for the next decade. So robotics and automation, we'll see an increase in the size of the global middle class, and we'll see a continued shift from services-based economy, a shift towards services-based economies. Okay, the products we buy or consume are likely to be increasingly customised to the individual needs, and defence spending of smaller nations may see shifts towards more regular incremental buys of new cheap technology in favour of large acquisitions. So the globalisation of supply chains will shift to adjust for increasing nationalism and trade that aligns with geopolitical objectives. This has the potential to significantly impact major trade groups such as the European Union, the US and China. And finally, the digitisation of supply chains and currencies has the potential to create a more transparent and safer global financial system. However, it will be met by increasingly sophisticated crime and corruption efforts to counter this progress, so it's uncertain how this will progress. The ability to govern digital systems will become a global challenge that moves beyond national borders. So socially, we will continue to adapt to our environment, or more likely, try to force our environment to adapt to us. Our population will continue to grow, but the rate of growth is declining. As our rate of growth declines, we will see ageing populations within more countries moving towards a point of stagnation or declining growth. The competition for skilled labour and consequently skilled migration is therefore likely to increase. Increasingly, we will interact professionally and personally through digital systems. This interaction will expose us to competing ideas and cultures, which is the foundation for innovation. It'll be an area to watch if this increased interaction will act as a force to unite us or divide us. And it will also be a point to note in this aspect is how those technology countries that control that digital interaction through social media will allow us to interact, whether they will shape our thoughts through what you see companies providing you the social media feeds that reinforce the narrative that they believe you agree with and hide the narrative that or opinions that you may not necessarily agree with, so they continue to reinforce the ideas that you like. So the authority of the state and governments will continue to dominate society. However, non-state influence from special interest groups or individuals will be increasingly prevalent. These influences will drive multiple competing demands on governments, and that may challenge the pace of regulation and control. And finally, on society, our maximum lifespan will likely remain stable. But the average age of death will increase, and people will maintain a higher quality of life in their later years. This could lead to increased productivity, but also an increased demand for the aged to continue to work in nations that have a stagnating or declining population. So just a couple of comments then on great power competition before I finish. I'll just draw your attention or your memory back to that original map. Okay. Within the next decade, the global future will be shaped by great power competition. That's how we see it at this point in time. And whilst it's evident that we talk about China and the US, that also includes the EU and includes India and also other potential rising powers such as Indonesia, who can have significant influence. So the way we've done this and the way we've looked at the world future from a global scenario point of view is we've proposed 4 generic scenarios. And these scenarios differ by where the power sits, whether it sits with the power of the state or whether there's a diffusion of power to other groups such as multinational corporations, individuals, community interest groups. And then the other axis there looks at whether these actors are cooperating or competing with each other. So as we move forward, the general consensus from us, or the general assessment from us is that we're moving towards a multipolar world. However, there is evidence, okay, this isn't binary in terms of its assessment, you don't sit in one or the other, okay. Different parts of the world will move into different areas, okay, and most likely also multilateralism. So great power competition leads us to a future world being described as multipolar, and the initial thoughts from a defence and security perspective lead that to being realised within competition within the Indo-Pacific region, which is what we mentioned at the start. So whilst the potential for conflict exists within the Indo-Pacific, it's important to remember that all nations are very likely to maintain a common goal in that area, and that is to avoid conflict. Competition is possible in a multipolar world without a collapse into conflict. Indeed, competition has the potential to drive us forward in technology development, and efforts to resolve global challenges such as climate change can even benefit from this type of future. In competing, we will likely see shifts in international alliances and partnerships, and ultimately, if we are successful in having major powers compete without lapsing into conflict in the Indo-Pacific, then what does that mean for the next war? The concept of a great peace isn't one that we consider likely, okay? But if you avoid conflict within the Indo-Pacific, then where is that likely to occur? And so going back to the first map, you could suggest that that conflict would exist within Africa and those high-stress regions of India. However, the other areas, and maybe a point of consideration when we look at that map, is maybe the view is wrong. Maybe instead of looking down, we should be looking up, and that the competition and conflict will occur in space, okay, or will occur in cyber systems, as opposed to the traditional physical conflicts that we've experienced in the past. Okay, that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take some questions before we move on to the next speaker. Yes.
Thank you very much. In the last slide, you mentioned that the future will be shaped in the conflict with US, EU, China, and so on. But in all of this, which is the role of the United Kingdom, which is not the European Union anymore, under a military perspective, very strong alliance with the US, and in the moment that you loosen the economic link, for example, with continental Europe, probably they will want to develop other commercial alliance, and I think this can play a role also for military alliance, because then commerce and military are connected. So how do you see the role of the UK in this scenario?
Yeah, so I think the role for the UK is most clearly articulated in its recently integrated review, which was released. And the UK still sees itself as, and sells itself as global Britain. Despite its decline over the last 100 years in terms of its empire, it sees itself as needing to have influence on a global stage. So whilst it has a strategy as a, I'm going to get the word right, but a tilt to the Indo-Pacific is the way they describe it. What tilt means, I'll leave that for you to determine, but they do have an interest in the Indo-Pacific, but primarily, as methods of peace or influence, it may not necessarily be military. Okay, and whilst they recently sailed one of their carrier groups through the Indo-Pacific region, it's influenced through political, educational means, through economic means that are more likely to occur from the UK. Yes.
Very interesting stress map at the beginning, but I haven't seen, or probably I missed it, the energy element. You have been talking about water security, you've been talking about food insecurity, nothing against energy. Is there a reason?
There's no reason specifically, no. I mean, it's definitely an area we pay close attention to. That specific map did not include energy. However, some of the other research we do, particularly that came out of our research into the High North and the influence of the Arctic, specifically focused on the energy. And a lot of our other research looks at energy, particularly the balance between the future of hydrocarbons compared to green energies and the balance of where that energy exists.
And the maritime choke point, located choke point?
Yeah, that's right. So maritime choke points are quite important, and particularly when we look at the great power competition, the maritime choke points of the Malacca Strait, but then also looking at the other trade choke points that globally become quite important. And you can link those to, geography is still powerful, and the cyber world and the space world doesn't stop everything, or it doesn't allow everything. And we mentioned that was mentioned in one of the other presentations. So those maritime choke points are quite important. And when you link that to some nations' global strategies, you can see that their strategies are linked to those choke points in terms of their areas of influence. Excellent.
Any other question?
Oh, sure.
In the coming great power competition, how do you value or how would you incorporate in your research the value system that is so important to us, Western ways, democracy, rule of law, that helps us to join together more easily and more routines, and of course the expectation to be an asset in the competition with other more authoritarian powers. How would you value, or how would you integrate that in your future studies when it comes to looking at future scenarios like that?
Yeah, so under the society system, we look at human values and therefore that interaction. One of the joys of my job is I only define problems. I don't provide solutions. So we propose the main customer for us, the UK government. So what we'll talk about the future of democracy, the future of autocratic states and authoritarianism and other governance type mechanisms. We'll talk about values and lifestyles that persist in certain areas. And then when we present that and how it's likely to change in the future, it's over to the governments really to decide how they want to act or influence policy associated with that. That's probably about as good as I get on that one.
That's a question, Ryan.
Sure, Derek.
On the general map, and actually throughout the whole structure, when you talk about global powers, let's see, global powers, or state powers, and I know you mentioned earlier non-state powers.
Yep.
Global powers are sort of in a way far easier to monitor, to understand movement and so on and so forth, because you see not fully so. But when you look at asymmetric and non-state powers, which is what we've been dealing with, let's say in New York, the whole power system of New York being taken out, which we saw for a whole week, right? I mean, recently, a lot of the sort of cyber attacks that have taken out systems that maybe we can't talk about, but fairly serious systems. Where does that fit into that map? Because it's a different overlay on that map, right, in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it doesn't fit on this map. Is that the first answer? But, I mean, they're complex issues. And so we look at, and we're doing this analysis to go through the next edition of Global Strategic Trends. But, you know, when you look at a multinational corporation that can have quite a fair bit of influence over government policy, but also it can move its workforce around quite easily. And how does that then happen when, you go to war or you're in conflict with someone and the workforce of that large multinational corporation sits in a country that you're at war with? Those are really complex issues combined with all the other non-state actors of religious groups within certain areas. What we do try and do, and you'll see it hopefully in Global Strategic Trends, is we do our best to move away from words and present futures in graphics as best as possible. So we always have that challenge of how do you represent these complex ideas and complex future scenarios in a graphic that's easily digestible, that people can kind of get an idea from the snapshot. So definitely something we're still working towards, Derek. Yeah.
Anyone else?